Good afternoon and welcome back to the second part of our program. We're very fortunate today to have a distinguished panel who are going to further our discussion on U.S. strategy in China and the Asia-Pacific region. Here to moderate this discussion is our very own Jacques deLisle, our very own, except he's also a professor at Penn, a very distinguished professor, and he's the director of our Asia program and of our new China Center as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the reins over to Jacques. Please take it away, Jacques.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank everyone for joining us. We have a tough act to follow, given Raleigh's session with Laura Rosenberger just before, but we have a panel that I'm sure can do that. So we're going to spend the next hour talking about the U.S. strategy toward China with a focus on military, economic, and technology issues. We have three terrific panelists to address these issues, and we will be taking audience questions. So if you have a question, please submit it at any time during our session in the Q&A box on the Zoom. And thank you to those of you who have submitted questions in advance. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So let me give our panelists a brief introduction, and then we'll turn to letting them weigh in on the topics of the day. So first we have Brendan Mulvaney. Dr. Mulvaney is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. He's a former Marine who served for a quarter century and flew more than 2,000 hours as an AH-1W Cobra pilot and served tours in California, Iraq, Japan, and the Western Pacific. He was also an Olmsted Scholar in Shanghai and the first director of the Commandant's Red Team and associate chair of the Languages and Cultures Department at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he taught Chinese language, Chinese culture, and cross-cultural literacy. Our next panelist is Karen Sutter. She is a specialist in Asian trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service with over 30 years of experience working on U.S. Asia policy and economic, political, technological, and national security issues. She previously served as the Director of Strategy and Analysis for the U.S. Air Force's Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis and as Special Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Investment and Senior Policy Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Investment Security at the U.S. Treasury Department, and also has been a senior analyst on China at the CIA. Finally, last but far from least, is Anna Puglisi. She is the Director of Biotechnology Programs and Senior Fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Previously, she served on the National Counterintelligence Officer for East Asia, advising senior U.S. and foreign government officials, academia, and the private sector on counterintelligence issues. She also played a leading role in drafting the U.S. National Counterintelligence Strategy, and in designing mitigation strategies for public and private sectors to protect technology. So as that brief sketch of what would be much longer CVs if I read them in their entirety, we'll turn to the topics, and I'll call on each panelist in turn to address his or her area of specialty. So let's start with the hard stuff. That is the hard power stuff. So to Brendan first, what are the key military challenges that China and China's role in its region and around the world pose for the United States?
Well, thanks for having me, and congrats on the launch of the center here, and for taking time to talk about this really important topic. So first, I'll give the disclaimer, I'm here in my personal capacity, despite my fancy banner in the background. But it is informed by years of working in the Marine Corps and for the Air Force. And I would say that China today, specifically the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is in a very different place than it was, 10, 20, or even 30 years ago, which is really the last big time that we sought to challenge them. During the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, the United States was able to sail in 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the Straits, kind of separate the sides, cool down the tensions, and everything kind of subsided. China realized that and has built over the last 2 decades a very steady, very almost monotonous but continual pace to build their military commensurate with their economic and now growing diplomatic might. And so the challenges we face today are very different from, like I said, most of the time that I spent in the military. And certainly going forward, it's going to become even more so. So our assured access, our ability to support all of those allies and partners that she talked about in the earlier session, absolutely critical to us and to our success. Our ability to support them, as well as their ability to support us, are now facing much bigger challenges than we ever had in the past. I do want to emphasize that the Chinese are not 10 feet tall. They are not insurmountable. They have lots and lots of challenges. They've just undergone a huge reorganization, and they're still kind of reeling from that. They are not parity on one-on-one on the United States, and they're certainly not a global military like they have plans to be by 2049. But that's the key right there, right? They have plans. They are long-term, and they have a structure of governance that allows them to execute over a long period of time on those set plans with very little deviation. So that's really, I kind of think, where our challenges lie in the future.
Okay, so a fair point that the challenges are big, although sometimes exaggerated. What is the U.S. doing right, and what is it doing wrong, or should it be doing right that it's not doing, to address those challenges?
So I think she hit the nail on the head. You know, we're focusing internally. We're trying to make sure that we remain competitive. And I think this administration has taken a turn toward rebuilding the allies and partners, which absolutely are going to be key to the area. So on that score, I think we're doing things right. Some of the bigger challenges, I don't know that we're doing anything wrong necessarily, but we have a different system of governance, which creates challenges. So at one point, we're trying to deter China by telling them, hey, we are still a global power. We are still the superpower in the region. And we do have this whole series of alliances, but then we have to turn around to Congress and say, well, we need more money, but we can't have a continuing resolution, but we're out of missiles and munitions throughout the Western Pacific. And China hears both of those stories. And it's a hard nut to crack in our system of government, where we have to rely the military relies on the executive branch, which then relies on the congressional branch, and everybody changes hands every couple of years. And so I wouldn't change our system of governance for theirs, but certainly it is a challenge that we have to live up to. That being said, I think that the U.S. military has done a pretty good job here, especially over the last couple of years, starting in the Trump administration, continuing into this one, to realizing and recognizing the challenge that we're going to face in the future. It's unlike what we faced certainly since the end of the Cold War, and even back that far, just a different scope and scale of challenge. And I think we've done a pretty good job. I was about to say pivoting, maybe that's a bad choice of words, but adapting to that and really focusing, hey, where are we going to trim down? Where are we going to put some investment? Talking about things that are radical. As a Marine, we're getting rid of some of the really big stuff that we like to, have go boom in favor of being more flexible. We're talking about bringing people in across different levels, both active duty and on civilian side. That was almost unthinkable before without going through maybe basic training or just a limited ability of that. So really taking advantage of all that the United States has to offer, especially in high tech and computers, where a lot of the future is going to lie. And the Chinese recognize that as well. And that's really where we're doing a pretty good job of competing. Nope, you're on mute. Jacques, you're on mute.
Sorry, still muted. Sorry about that. So before turning to the next topic, I want to just give you an opportunity to weigh in a little bit on specific things you think the U.S. should be doing. You touched on it a little bit with sort of getting from things that go boom into a more variegated set of approaches. But one of the big issues, of course, is dealing with Chinese A2, AD, that area access denial type issue. So what should we be doing concretely in terms of whether it be systems or doctrine or strategy to deal with some of the issues you've been identifying?
Well, I think the thing that, in my mind, the most important thing that we need to be doing, we're probably not doing well enough or could be doing much better, is integrating those allies and partners into those, not just the systems, right? It's great that the Japanese are partners in the F-35, but we need to make sure that the Japanese and the Philippines and the Australians and the Singapores and India, for as much as we can, are integrated at the beginning. Right. So when we develop the doctrine, as the United States, Air Force is developing its ACE doctrine, we develop these flexible alternatives and things like that. We need to bring them into the beginning. How do they figure into that doctrine? How do they figure into those systems? We can't just show up with the high-speed option that we've developed and say, now everybody either gets to buy this or you have to figure a way to integrate it. That's not going to work, because we're going to rely on them absolutely in ways that we did not need to in the past. And so in the future, they are going to be absolutely critical. And, I like to remind people, the United States, especially the Air Force, but also the Navy, talks about stand-in versus standoff forces. Who's going to be in the region? Can we fight from outside of this, the first island chain or the second island chain? How do we fight our way in through the A2AD, the counter intervention strategy? But I like to remind everyone that folks in Japan, the folks in Taiwan, and in the Philippines are all stay in, live in forces, and they don't have the opportunity and the flexibility to move back outside of those. And we need to keep that in mind as we go and develop our strategies, because they are our allies and partners. And without them, we face I don't want to say insurmountable challenge, but a much, much greater challenge that we really just don't need to if we rely on them. But we need to bring them in earlier. The last chief of staff of the Air Force had a great little saying that we need to get from no foreign to yes foreign. And that talks about we have the Five Eyes, which is great. But if you notice, there was only one country in that whole region that I talked about that's a member of the Five Eyes. We need to find ways to be able to incorporate specifically our Japanese partners and everyone else in the region to a lot more of these, especially when it comes to space and cyber, which automatically gets super highly classified and we can barely talk about amongst ourselves. We got to figure out ways to bring them in, because that's going to be where the future battlefield is at least kicked off, if not won or severely hampered.
Terrific. Thanks for that introduction to some really complex issues there. Well, since at least the 19th century, it's fair to describe China's quest as one for wealth and power. We've been talking about power. Now let's shift over to wealth with Karen Sutter. So I'm going to ask you some of the same questions on the economic front, in terms of economic competition and economic dependence and vulnerability and so on. What are the biggest challenges you see the U.S. facing in its relations with China?
John, thank you so much for the question. And it's really an honor to be part of this panel and program. I also want to congratulate you all on your China initiative. I would just mention before I answer your question that I do work for the US government for CRS. And I just want to make a quick caveat comment that CRS works exclusively for the US Congress. We provide timely, authoritative, objective, and nonpartisan analysis for Congress. And because of that, CRS takes no position on policies, legislation, which Congress may consider. So I just want to, because we are delving into policy issues, I just want to lead with that. With regard to your specific question, I would quickly make 5 points. I think there are 5 basic areas that are challenging in the United States in the area of economics. One is the area of Chinese industrial policies. These policies are unprecedented in their scope and scale and their ambitions. While China says it's following a policy of technology independence, China is using industrial policies to target acquiring US technology and capabilities and those of its allies and partners. It's using companies as the tip of the spear to realize the policy goals. These policies, not just MCF, military civil fusion, all of the industrial policies are inherently dual use in nature, and they also focus on basic and applied research. The number 2 bucket related to this is China is increasingly setting the terms of trade. It's setting the terms of commercial ties with the United States. It's using controlled selective access to its market to set terms for US companies and universities that want to be there as a top market. And it's distorting the use of trade tools, anti-dumping, antitrust, IP, standards, procurement. We can talk about it in more detail, but they're using these tools in very unique ways that other countries do not to force the divestiture and transfer of know-how to Chinese entities. And I think that's a key challenge for the United States. The third area is China is leveraging open markets to expand and develop and acquire the capital, technology, and capabilities that it needs, but it's not reciprocating in kind. So this lack of reciprocity and this asymmetry in access is becoming increasingly pronounced. And this is affecting, again, this pursuit of industrial policies and China's ability to set the terms of trade. The fourth area is the growing role of the state in the economy. This has been going on. It predates Xi Jinping. It goes back to right after China joined the WTO, but it's become more intensified under China's leader, Xi Jinping, since 2014. And also China's growing assertiveness. So we talked in the last panel discussing about the use of trade and economic coercion. China also, over the past several years, has enacted a series of national economic security measures and countermeasures against US policy authorities and actions that's worth considering that directly challenge the United States and others. And it's also, I think, worth talking about China's ambitions on data sovereignty. as a core area of challenge to the United States and others in the system. The last point I would make in the fifth bucket is that current US tools and approaches may be mismatched against what China is engaged in. In particular, there's this issue of the role of the state. So when you're dealing with Chinese corporate activity, are you dealing with a state actor, or are you dealing with a commercial actor, or is it a hybrid actor? The other challenge is a lot of US tools and approaches are looking on a case-by-case level versus a strategic systemic approach. And if you don't have a strategic systemic approach, you may miss the potential risks or implications of individual commercial transactions. And I think China's last point I'll make here is China's selective opening of its market. The use of carrots and sticks and how companies can come into the market allows it to play off companies, industries, and countries. And so this issue of coercion and how China has been so successful in this area is fundamentally, I think, tied to some of those tactics and practices.
Okay, well then I'll turn to what should we be doing about it? What are we doing right, and what are we not doing right that we should be?
I guess in response, I would just maybe respond to the three buckets that the administration seems to be using. One is, there's been an articulation of the core challenge and the dynamics as one of strategic competition. So a framing of some of these issues, which I think can be important. The question then flows from that of what does this mean? I don't see as much of this sense of policy urgency, prioritization, and action. The other thing is, as I mentioned, this case-by-case approach to concerns about individual Chinese companies or activities versus a more systemic approach that would look at, for example, the role of the state, lack of reciprocity, some of these underlying core issues, forced technology transfer. I also think in one thing to consider in the framing of strategic competition is there a false equivalency between the US and China? And what do I mean by that? China's been pushing for a long time to be treated as a great power and an equal to the United States. And I haven't seen a clarification on this. I also think that there's no calling out that China in this competition, this strategic competition, is playing by fundamentally different rules. And so is there a risk if you don't highlight in the narrative what these distinctions are and what they mean for the United States, then it implies that we're playing on equal footing, that we're following the same rules. And then I think the other part of it would be, it's not articulated how the United States and China are currently economically intertwined. And because of that, as you have these challenges and risks, how do you force hard choices? And that's where I think strategic messaging and also this adjudication of priorities becomes very important. Laura mentioned a couple areas: climate, healthcare, and the idea of cooperation. These areas, renewable technology, novel drugs, advanced medical devices. We've seen it during COVID-19 and how China's politicized PPE, the Chinese hacking of Moderna and developing the vaccine. These are at the core of Chinese strategic industrial policies. So I think there's also a little bit of mismatch of this competition and cooperation element. And then the last piece of that would be, where are the hard actions to counter some of the Chinese activity? So again, this statist role, growing role in the economy, economic and trade coercion, lack of reciprocity, tech transfer continuing, new industrial policies, for example, in semiconductors coming out. I don't see specific systemic responses to some of these areas. The other thing would be in the promotion piece. The second area would be, there's promotion. I don't see as much of the protection piece. So if you're investing in the United States, what are you doing to protect that investment? For example, through the life cycle of a technology. Are PRC nationals and institutes going to be participating in that research, in that corporate ecosystem? And then with coordination with allies and partners, it seems that this work is in the early stages. What I'm looking for is, are there efforts to avoid China playing off countries and industries? to make sure that when China imposes economic coercion, that certain countries or industries are not backfilling as a result of those actions. And then what is the United States and what are US allies and partners willing to do? What are the red lines on what countries are not going to be giving to China in response to these measures? So just a couple areas.
Okay, but before turning to the next topic, I want to follow up a little bit on this. So are we fighting the right wars here, right? One of the criticisms of US policy over the last several years was it was too focused on the least important issues, right? It was, are you going to buy more agricultural exports and that sort of thing? Are you commit to buy more not super cutting edge technology? So have we focused our energies in the wrong place? And of course, the Biden administration has kept the tariffs in place that the Trump administration put in place and is focused on implementing the phase 1 trade deal. And is there a risk that we need to be worried about in some of the measures you're talking about that it could lead to a decoupling spiral? China is trying to get more self-sufficient. Some of the things we've heard from you and from Laura Rosenberger talk about self-sufficiency on the US side. Should we be wary of unintended consequences of policies that could promote decoupling?
You know, the China market is very important to US industry. But what I've been looking at is what are in my own research, what are the terms of trade? So for example, if you look at the top 4 US exports to China, aerospace, semiconductor chips, agriculture, advanced medical equipment. In each of these 4 areas are Chinese industrial policy activities that require US companies, incentivize US companies to come to China and give their technology, their capabilities, and their direct know-how to develop these capabilities in China. China sets terms for the financing of a lot of these products and items. And I can go into more detail, but I think it's not trade or not trade, it's the terms of trade. And so China increasingly, because there aren't countermeasures to what it's doing, is setting these terms. And China is a large, important market. And so I think US companies and other foreign companies are caught in the middle because they want to be in the market, but the terms in the market are highly extractive. And so China's very good at basically helping industry profit from basically China's goals of decoupling and China's goals of displacing and competing at the commanding heights where US industry currently is.
Okay, so if there are no other specific policies you want to address at this point, we'll turn to our third topic, but last bite at this apple if you want.
Yeah, I would just say one thing on just things that I'm watching, you know, as far as allies and partners, Laura mentioned the Airbus-Boeing settlement. There's a provision in that agreement that Europe and the United States will not be transferring advanced aerospace capabilities under requirements imposed by a non-market economy, production, or technology. So what does that mean in practice? And I think also watching phase 1, a lot of, you mentioned the tariffs, a lot of China's made in China 2025 industries are now coming online. Electric vehicles with lithium-ion batteries is a key example. And so, you know, you have tariffs currently in place under Section 301 with some exceptions, but what's the alternative and what's the US response to subsidized advanced technology exports coming out of China, some from foreign or US companies and some from PRC firms? How do you handle that? Because now it's real. In 2018, USTR was trying to get ahead of this issue. Now it's real. And so I think as we talk about tariffs and other US policy tools, it's important to consider that. And I guess the other thing I would mention I'm also watching is what is the US doing domestically and what are US domestic priorities and how is that informing trade policy? So in particular on the technology side, the ICT protection, the authority that Commerce has to look at risks in telecommunications and internet and software tied businesses. What actions are they going to take under this authority? And also the White House and DoD recently updated their critical technology lists. How is that going to inform export controls, foreign investment review, and other considerations for the US government might take? And then Anna will talk about more of this, I'm sure, but the issue of research, two-way investment, and financial investment as other areas. What are what's the U.S. position on these issues? What's the administration's position on these issues? So it's early days. Watching.
That's a nice segue to Anna. I think Karen's given us a bit of a lead into this, but what would you identify as the major challenges in technology competition with China and China's actions in the tech realm that pose challenges for the U.S.?
Great. So I'm here, I'm batting cleanup to kind of wrap all the ideas.
And you and I both have the luxury of not having to give a disclaimer. That's the joy.
Great. I know, being an academic, so that's actually good. You know, I'm going to pull on a couple of those threads because I think the comments of both our panelists, really, there are some underlying assumptions that really shape, I think, the challenges that we're facing, and it goes across, I think, all three dimensions: not only the tech, trade, military. And especially because of the way, and Karen just talked about this, the system is so inherently different, right? And when we think about what are those perhaps irritants in the relationship, or how we actually talk about civil military fusion or integration or whatever word they're using this decade or now, it really comes at that system and the assumptions and how we've approached China. And so the first is, you know, and I'm going to put this out here because we still kind of hear is what is the nature of this competition, right? I mean, and where and across with segments of society, or is it all of society that we're facing that competition? I mean, China really does view technology and the robust S&T infrastructure needed to develop it as a national asset. And that really cuts across military, economic, and even in some ways societal, because we see the way China has rebuilt its university systems and all of those foundational pieces that it needs to drive industries of the future. And at the same time, China has made, its leaders have made really no effort to hide their views, that they really want to seek dominance in a lot of these areas. If you look at the Chinese language materials and how they view a robust S&T infrastructure as key, not only to continuing their military modernization, but also the economic piece. And so I think it's really important when we look across these spheres that, you know, we take a really broad look at what national security really is, because it does encompass both military and economic, because at least that's how China views it. And that, you know, that it's clear and well documented that Beijing, especially Xi, looks at this development as zero-sum game. And that government support for key industries, such as emerging technologies, AI, next generation communications, biotechnology, will give China an advantage. And she actually talks about that, and the allusion to commanding sees the commanding heights of technological innovation, down to holding AI in its own hands. So it's a very, very different approach to collaboration, and really, you know, kind of in some ways really challenges the global norms of science. When we look back, we look at how, you know, the US and our allies and like-mindeds, you know, Director Rosenberg talked about the values of technology. It's looking at, okay, is China's behavior undermining those global norms of science, and the challenges in how we approach both, you know, scientist to scientist, institution to institution. And again, it really kind of gets at that system, you know, and how the Chinese government has incentivized behaviors that are basically undermine the system that we all kind of operate in. And Karen alluded to a little bit of that, but it really kind of gets at, you know, the whole idea of market competition, a fair and level playing field, and that transparent reciprocity, right? Knowing that the person that you bring into your lab or the person that you're building that joint venture with is really what they seem to be on the surface. And again, operating in that system that, you know, has different laws, and we talk a little bit about the national security law, but the whole idea of the role of the state, not only in corporations, but also in universities, and how they can drive and incentivize the agenda. And it really kind of, at the end of the day, I'm gonna be really blunt about that, but it's the China doesn't play fair, in a lot of these rules. It's in those setting the terms, not only of trade, but also of our open institutions that are just really not set up to counter these kinds of policies and programs that I might add have been in place for decades, to both the talent programs, their technology acquisition strategies. And then I think one of the other challenges is that the status quo really benefits vested interests in the short term, right? So whether it be companies, whether it be funding for different academic programs, which is why that promote part is really, really important as well.
Okay, so that's a good sense of where you see the weak points, the vulnerabilities. What do you think of the policies and the measures the U.S. has adopted to deal with it? What's right, what's wrong, and what should we be adding?
Great. So I think the fact that we're actually beginning to talk about these challenges, right, and really starting to table what is, and talking about realistically what is going on. And it really is the promote part, and looking at improving ourselves. In some ways, I think, especially in the tech sector, we've kind of forgotten our own history, in the sense of, there are certain things that are resource and time intensive that the commercial sector is just not going to deliver on. I mean, I think we can look at 5G as a great example of that. And so beginning to look at unpacks, and that's not, that we see a lot of arguments about how, we were going to out China. We're not going to do that. And that's not saying to go back or to take on, things that are not a market economy, but it's recognizing that there are certain key, nationally secure parts of our infrastructure that are really important, and that whether that be medical supply chains, 5G, our own genomic data, that we need to look beyond the lowest price.
Okay. Anything else you want to add to the specific prescription list, or shall we go to our discussion with some questions from the audience?
Okay, I think I'm gonna, there's one other aspect that I think comes up all the time. So it's always the elephant in the room, so to speak, is whether China is innovative or not. And I think we get so wrapped around the axle in some ways of thinking, and having that really color, that it's an either or. And so I think in, approaching our policies and our programs, it really impacts the population.
Yes, and there's quite a literature on that, which we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon delving into, including a curious cycle of Chinese patent applications, which spike right before the accounting year ends for bonuses and so on. All right, so there's a lot to chew on there, and I have tons of things I'd like to ask you about, but I'm going to put a few things in from our audience first, at least. So we've got some. So I'll take these sort of back to front. So just to pick up on some of what Anna was just talking about, one of the really controversial moves in the space you're dealing with is the DOJ China initiative, which of course has gone after people in the tech sphere. Most notable success, actually, not involving a Chinese ethnic, but many have been Chinese ethnics or former Chinese nationals. And there's been a fair amount of criticism that this is aiming a bazooka at the problem, and that it departs from what many would prescribe as a sort of small yard, high fence strategy, and that it really sort of isn't hitting the right target. So what do you make of that initiative, and how do we manage to deal with the threats you're talking about without, without unduly compromising principles of free academic exchange or the kinds of things that have made American universities global research centers?
No, that's a really important point. And I always, some of you saw my testimony this summer, but I think it's really important to put out there that there is no room for xenophobia in the US, and that the principles of our nation. I mean, I have an immigrant family, and it's just because of that we need to find a principled way forward. However, we need to really focus on the policies and programs of a nation state that seek to undermine that openness and also to incentivize their own citizens. I think, you look, I think there was just most recently some media reports about the pressure that is put on students and put on faculty. And we can't, I think by treating China as a neutral actor, we undermine those individuals who want to do the right thing. And I think what's lost in the debate on, we could argue individual cases, we can argue it hasn't been messaged well. Often there's the argument of, well, it's not economic espionage. And I would push back on that to say, our system is set up to counter the Soviet Union, right? We look for things that involve intelligence officers, we look for things that are directly military related, and things that are illegal under a very narrow statute. That's not how China targets us. And the initial fact sheet, if you look at that came out with the DOJ's China initiative, actually, and this really should be country agnostic, because these are none of the behaviors that undermine our system that we want anyone to participate in. Scientific endeavors is built on trust, right? So if you're sending applications that are sent to you for peer review for grants, and you're sending that overseas to somebody else, we can argue that's administrative or personally. Lately we're hearing it's just fraud. I mean, since when is fraud okay? So I think it comes down to, like, do you view China a neutral actor? And also looking at, these policies and programs, again, these are not new with the Chinese. These are central government policies I have looked at since the early 90s. We see references to them till today. And so that gets at the whole question of how do we talk about this challenge and how do we talk about this problem? And I think one of the other challenges with this is that China is really good at identity politics. They understand the seams that we have, right? And they fund the United Workfront group. They fund influence in that soft power piece. And that, I think, makes it even equally as challenging, because as Americans, we don't want to think, talk about those kinds of things. And so that's part of the challenge as well.
Well, some of the China soft power initiatives haven't worked out so well, the attempts to tell China's story and all that. But down in Washington, you all just saw the incident at George Washington University where I think identity politics were played pretty effectively, what were essentially political protest posters for the Olympics. So I want to weave together a couple of questions we've got from the audience here, which I think straddles a bit from Anna's focus back to Karen's. Which is, in China in recent years under Xi, we've seen in some sense an intensification of the party control over major enterprises, including in the sectors that you've been talking about, party committees within companies, political pressure brought to bear on some tycoons, Jack Ma and others like that, for a variety of reasons, but some of which include perhaps being a little off message, as it were. And you have companies like Huawei and ZTE, which obviously have, as both Anna and Karen have pointed out, complex entanglements with the state and its industrial policies. So what should U.S. policy be doing about that, either directly in managing the access and opportunities of those companies, or in dealing with U.S. companies that are counterparties to transactions and ventures with these Chinese firms? I'll start with Karen on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very serious phenomena that's been going on for a while. I think that the awareness of the pervasiveness of the problem, I think maybe is the first issue of just, when you're looking at a Chinese entity, if you're looking at a Chinese entity and they have a key role in the Chinese economy and they're in a strategic sector, they have some type of government support or ties, whether that's direct funding, sponsorship. There's something going on there for them to be able to, maybe they didn't start that way, but I think understanding that is very important. One thing we haven't talked about is the shift in how since the medium long-term plan on science and technology was started to be implemented back in 2006, is China's use of government guidance funds, a venture capital model to fund basically the corporate sector who's implementing its industrial policies. So in the past, it would be simpler. You would say, these are the state-owned enterprises under the CSET State Council. Now they're 98, they've been consolidating over a period of time. But in fact, when you're looking at strategic and emerging technologies, new companies, the state ties are more complex. And in addition to government guidance funds, basically we have Ministry of Finance providing the state subsidies through government or government-tied venture capital funds, in turn going into sub-VC funds, and in turn commingling now with foreign monies, both in China and outside of China. And so these government ties are quite pervasive, and China's a strategic actor. As Anna was saying, they're looking at, how do I use foreign commercial ties to develop China? And so I think this awareness and appreciation for what's going on is probably the most important thing. And then figuring out, okay, what are the tools, what are the approaches you have, depending on what part of the economy you're looking at, depending on what you're participating in. If you're looking at access to data, if you're looking at an acquisition of a US business, if you're looking at export controls, if you're looking at venture capital in the United States, which is passive, but you have a strategic Chinese investor, what does that mean? The implications are fundamentally, potentially different. So I think that awareness piece is really, really important, and it hasn't been well discussed, I think, or understood.
Okay, great, thanks. Now we're going to turn back to the military contingencies a bit. So I want to ask Brendan this issue. So we have a few questions in the chat that get into essentially the question of how, under the changing conditions, the U.S. maintains effective deterrence. Several of the questions are focused specifically on the Taiwan Strait, which is, of course, in many ways the most likely, certainly one of the most concerning flashpoints in the region. So how does the U.S. maintain deterrence given China's longstanding position that if Taiwan does not cooperate on whatever China's time frame turns out to be, the use of force is potentially on the table? And as you pointed out in your opening remarks, a lot of the investment in PLA modernization has been focused, at least initially, on a Taiwan contingency. And then of course many of the forms of pressure that are being brought to bear are increasingly in the gray zone, right? Invading the ADIZ and sort of ratcheting up the baseline level of military activity. So all that stuff's going on. How do we maintain deterrence in the Taiwan Strait, and how much do we have to do different tactics for other contingencies?
Yeah, two great questions. First, I just want to dovetail on the last point, because I don't know how well it's known, but we did a project earlier looking at trying to suss out some of these companies, and it came to light the percentage of tech transfers that are approved to China by the US government, because we held ourselves to a very high standard. I'll let your audience pause for a second and think what that number would be. It came as a huge shock to me. It was over 90%. Over 90% directly to Chinese entities for high-tech transfers get approved, because we can't, to a standard which we hold ourselves, describe exactly what the ties to the PLA or the party are. So that's one of those issues.
I just say we see a similarly high clearance rate for Chinese inbound investment into the U.S. CFIUS is something China likes to say is this incredibly exclusionary process, but the vast majority of deals do go through.
Right, which just emphasizes the point that, China is perfectly willing to go through licit means to acquire the technology and the capabilities and know-how, in addition to all the other illicit or less than above board processes. But let's get back to the military stuff. Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Certainly, the increase in the rocket forces capabilities. They have both the conventional missile and the ballistic missiles. New strategic missiles as well. Have increased dramatically over the last 20 years. This has probably been one of the biggest challenges, or biggest emphasis that both Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping have put on improving the PLA. We see the Air Force expanding. We need to be careful about when we talk about flights into the ADIZ, because technically Taiwan got to draw its own ADIZ, and part of it actually extends over the mainland. So you can take off, fly over the mainland and land at your own Air Force base all over the mainland, and you've still encroached on Taiwan's ADIZ. So we need to be careful when we talk about that, what exactly we're talking about. Most of it is down in a corner away from the main island of Taiwan. But it is certainly more aggressive. It is certainly more active. And the Chinese are obviously building up their aircraft carrier fleet, probably not for a full global presence as the United States military has, but certainly anything that goes in and on around Taiwan or the South China Sea or in the region to execute that policy of deterrence, to keep the United States out at bay long enough for them to accomplish their strategic goals, right? So all of these are new facets. What are we doing about it? Well, we are working on new technologies. We're working on, obviously the F-35 is still the greatest aircraft out there. The Chinese know that. They know by hook or by crook. And remember, they steal a lot, not just from the United States, but from the Russians. So they continue to deal in high quality aircraft engines from Russia, as well as avionics and things like that. But they come up with new and novel ways that we wouldn't necessarily go to fight because they have a different problem set. Their problem set is just 100 miles away. Ours is all the way across the Pacific. It's a long way from the mainland. It's a long way from Hawaii or even Guam. And it's really not all that close to our main bases in Japan. So they just have a different problem set, and we have to figure out how we're going to get in there. Ballistic missile defenses, getting our allies tied into those. Again, the communications relay system and the C4ISR network that is going to be absolutely key are still to the United States' advantage. China has is developing ways to counter each of those. They know that our strengths lie in our space-based capabilities and our cyber capabilities and our ability to network all that together. They know that's a huge challenge for the PLA at this moment. But again, if they get to choose the time and place of the action, they can simply wait till they feel that they're ready for it. So the United States, working in concert with our partners, is definitely trying to improve our capabilities, intelligence sharing, indications and warnings and things like that, so that we have enough time and information to deter the Chinese and go to them and say, look, we know what you're going to do. You're not going to succeed, and here's why. But again, as China continues to develop things which hold U.S. And Japanese and Taiwan's assets at risk, we are going to have to shift our mindset and perhaps shift away from what we've had the luxury of since the end of the Cold War, in basically, I don't want to say completely benign environments, but certainly as far as the Air Force goes and air power goes, we've had largely uncontested environments to work in. That's just not going to be the case. Probably isn't the case today. The PLA has air-to-air missiles that fly farther than ours. They have, like I said, the whole integrated air defense system along the coastline, which is going to be a challenge. And so we just have to continue to focus on that. And somebody said in the economic round, we don't want to go, 1 for 1. We don't want to play their game because that's not to our benefit. Same thing for, our challenge. So we have to develop things that are going to work for our challenge set and against what China's trying to do.
Okay, well, one more security-related question before I turn back to economics for our final question as we come up against our time here, which is one of our audience questioners asked how much we should be worried about a China-Russia alliance. I mean, Putin just visited Xi. It's against the background of greater cooperation between the two. They declared limitless cooperation, whatever that means. And of course, everybody's buzzing about Putin and Ukraine, Taiwan and Xi and all that sort of stuff. So how seriously do you take this alliance, which some would describe as a reluctant marriage of convenience, versus something that we really need to take seriously in our own security planning?
Well, I'd say just because it's a reluctant marriage doesn't mean it's not a marriage, to stretch that analogy. There is no great deep-seated love between the Chinese and the Russians. Toward the end of the Cold War, the Chinese were far more concerned the Russians were coming over the border than the United States, which is why we started to partner with them and they partnered with us. We're coming up on the anniversary of Nixon's visit, right? But there is absolutely an alignment of strategic incentives and strategic goals. And so as long as that continues, we should expect to see China and Russia working together. I wouldn't say it's an alliance as the United States alliance system is. They are not committed to supporting one another in a military endeavor, be it on their border or somewhere else. But certainly there is a greater degree of integration, a great degree of transfer. Russia has basically acceded to the fact that China has surpassed it as a space power. China still has the edge in aerospace engines and aerospace capabilities, and they continue to partner with that But absolutely, those interests are going to continue to align, and we should expect to see more joint flights, more joint exercises, more joint naval operations, and things like that, because certainly they want to leverage one off the other. And as we try to play both ends, right, they're working from the middle out, and we are worried about our NATO allies as well as our Asian allies. So this is absolutely something we should pay attention to. Cassie has a couple papers looking specifically at aerospace cooperation, and it's going to be one of the topics at our annual conference this year in May here at National Defense University, because it is such an important issue. And if it continues to develop in ways that are amenable to the United States' strategic interests, then we really will have to come up with some new ways of dealing with the future threats.
Okay, terrific. So the last question, I'll invite Karen and Anna to answer in turn. Maybe I'll splice a couple together here. One is what you make of the talk from the Biden administration of an Indo-Pacific economic framework, kind of the economic parallel or accompaniment to the Indo-Pacific strategy and security realm. And Brendan said we shouldn't think of the PLA as 10 feet tall. The questioner asks, essentially, should we think of the Chinese economy as 10 feet tall? Where are the weaknesses in the Chinese economy that put some limits, perhaps, on the ability to pursue the policies you're talking about, whether it be inequality or zombie enterprises, or take your pick. So first, Karen, and then Anna.
Okay, no, thank you. So as far as the Indo-Pacific framework, just highlight that on the one hand, I mean, we're just starting to, there's not that much detail right now, but from what we can see, it raises the question of, is this going to be an opportunity for the United States to go deep on certain issues with allies and partners like-mindeds in the region, export controls, supply chains, issues that Laura mentioned, in the previous hour. And so that's a chance to go deep. On the other hand, China's moves are quite bold. China's trade policy broadly is quite bold. Its industrial policies, its digital sovereignty initiative. And so, is this a substitute for the US not playing on the global stage, as far as, people talk about, the US, didn't, pulled back from TPP. There's no sign of going forward with CPTPP. And so, where's the broader narrative policy leadership to counter China's bold moves? And so I think that's something to consider. And then also kind of what are we going to do specifically with allies and partners? How is this going to reinforce what's going on in the Quad? What's going on in the Trade Technology Council with Europe? How are these things, how are we going to push back on trade coercion? Is there going to be concerted action? Are there going to be costs imposed on China? Is there going to be agreement not to backfill on commercial deals when China sanctions and puts embargoes on other allies and partners? What does that look like? As far as China's weaknesses, China's a couple of things. The US is a technology leader. It's not a small garden, it's a huge farm. And so, this idea, just to pick on that, but, China's coming from behind. And I think in some of the discussions more recently, it's easy to forget that the US is still the economic and technology leader, and China is seeking to upset that paradigm with policies that seek to take know-how from the United States. And so it's really, and also China is still very reliant in a dysfunctional way on fixed asset investment. And so with US financial investment, with US technology transfer, are we filling China's gaps? Are we basically supporting these points of weakness in the Chinese economy in ways that are helping or not helping US industry and the United States more broadly? I think is the question to ask.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. We're just about up against our time. So Anna, you get the last word.
Thank you. And also wanted to thank you for hosting this wonderful panel, and good luck with the new China initiative that you are undertaking. So it's conversations like these that I think really push the needle forward. So I think really it's the kind of my parting thoughts is really to kind of focus on, it really comes down to with the challenges that we're dealing with a really different system. And we can argue whether that system is going to survive or be successful in the long run. But over the next couple of decades, and we've seen this in the last decade, it can still have a lot of market distortions and really kind of change some of the global norms that we're dealing with, especially in both across all of these areas, whether it be trade, whether it be technology developments, and also how that then feeds into military modernization. And so it's just keeping that in mind and what assumptions we're bringing to the table when we're looking out to see, okay, how do we counter some of these policies?
Well, thank you so much. As this last hour, which has flown by, tells us that there is a huge amount to discuss here, crucially important questions for the United States, for China and the world in terms of what China is up to, the geoeconomic pursuits of China, its strategic implications, and so on. And we've had just a terrific panel to discuss this. So I want once again to thank Brendan Mulvaney, Karen Sutter, and Anna Puglisi for just a terrific discussion across a wide range of issues. I hope that all of you who've been in our audience today will continue to follow the activities of the new China Center here at FPRI, as well as our Asia program. Programming, for now, we're still almost entirely on Zoom, so you can join from the comfort of your home. We hope you'll join us for that. We hope you'll also consider becoming a member of FPRI or otherwise supporting our activities. So again, thank you to our audience. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Lauren Rosenberger earlier and Raleigh Flynn for hosting that. And we'll see you soon. Good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.